Okay, good morning everyone. We're just bringing you in from the waiting room for today's webinar. Thank you for joining us. Once we've got you all in from the room, we will be kicking off. And it's my job as Chief Exec at London Funders to welcome you to today's webinar. This is the second in our series of 3 webinars reflecting on where we are, sort of 2 years on from that first lockdown, and where funders can go next to build on the work we've done together over those last 2 years. If you missed the first in the series of 3, which looks at learning from before COVID that we've built on, I'm sure you will subscribers to the London Funders YouTube channel. If you're not already, do head on over there and you can find that recording to have a look at. That includes reflections on infrastructure, equity, funding practice, and brings together some of the highlights from the Reports Reloaded blog series that we had that built on some of the reports and learning that we had in place before the pandemic. Today's session, though, is going to bring together this excellent panel you can see on your screens in front of you to share their reflections on some of the key lessons for funders from the pandemic and how priorities are being shaped as we look now into the future. And I'm sure that the terrific trio that you can see on your screen now need no introduction from me, but it is my job to give an introduction, so I will do that anyway. We're joined by, firstly, Tanya Cohen, Chief Executive of 360 Giving. And you'll all know that we're big fans of 360 Giving at London Funders, and we encourage all of our members to publish their data to the standard. So you'll be hearing a bit more from Tanya on her reflections from those last 2 years. And handily, Tanya, I think you started your job just pretty much as lockdown 1 kicked in. So these are live reflections, lived experience reflections from those last 2 years about how data has been used and how funders have responded, but obviously also building on your experience across civil society over 20 years. Looking at how data can drive change, and we've worked with you on the London community response, but also things like the immigration advice strategy for London. Copies available on the London Funders website. So we know that data and thinking about that is quite a key part of how we're going to go forward together. So we're looking forward to hearing from you. Next on your screens, you'll see Natalie Creary, who's the Programme Delivery Director of Black Thrive Lambeth, but also wearing a second hat, and the one that I have the joy of working with her on as co-chair of the Building Stronger Communities mission, which is one of the 9 recovery missions set by the London Recovery Board in consultation with Londoners, civil society and partners. And that working group has been really critical in terms of how we think about working across sectors and across communities to build strong communities. But Natalie's also been bringing her experience from Black Thrive, which, as you know, is a partnership working to dismantle the structural barriers that create and sustain mental health inequalities for Black African and African Caribbean communities in Lambeth. And Natalie's work is also with communities and grassroots organisations looking at having ownership of their stories and about addressing the social challenges that they may face. So they're really relevant and important issues and approaches that we know have been at the forefront of your minds over the pandemic, and also as you're coming into this period looking at the future. So it's fantastic that we've got Natalie joining us as well. And last but not least, kindly interrupting his holiday to be with us is Ben Cairns, Director of IVAR, the Institute for Voluntary Action Research. And if you're a regular attender at London Funders webinars, you'll know that we've worked with IVAR to capture the learning from previous emergencies, with the findings in The Possible Not the Perfect also available on the London Funders website, which helped lay the foundations for the funder collaboration we brought together in response to COVID. But you'd also know that some of the work we did 2 years ago, with over 400 funders signing up to the We Stand With the Sector statement, looked at changes to approaches to funding as well. And the expert work of Ben and the team at IVAR with the Open and Trusting Grant Makers movement is one we really strongly endorse and support, building on some of those opportunities to learn and develop from what we've done. So Ben will bring some of that to the fore, but also from some of the 250 odd projects I think you've led at IVAR over the years, Ben. So really pleased that you're part of our discussions today. In terms of the format for today, in a minute I'm going to ask our thrilling 3 to share some opening remarks with us before we go into a conversation to build on their reflections. And as part of that, there's an opportunity for us to take some questions from you in our live audience. And I'm sure you'll know the drill after 2 years of doing these meetings, but we can't see your beautiful faces because we're in webinar format. So the way we need to interact with you is through the Q&A and chat boxes at the bottom of the screen. So if you do have a question you want to ask our panel or a point you'd like us to reflect on, if you use the Q&A box at the bottom of your screen, that's the one I'll be keeping an eye on, and I'll be able to bring those into the conversation. And if you've just got some reflections or resources or ideas that you want to share that aren't necessarily for the panel, but just to share with the wider audience, you can use the chat box at the bottom of the screen for that as well. And that's also where my colleague Milena will be posting any links to resources, reports, that kind of thing that come up in the conversation today. So you've got access to those through the chat box. So chat box for any reflections, sharing resources, and keeping an eye on what the London Funders team are sharing with you, and the Q&A box if you want to ask a question to the panel or pose a point for us to reflect on. Hopefully you know the drill and that's all okay. We're going to be talking for about an hour, so we'll take those initial reflections, we'll open up to conversation, and then we'll round it off so you'll be done within the hour, and hopefully be able to take forward those reflections in your work after today. So without any further ado, I'm going to ask our panel to kick us off with some of their initial reflections and opening remarks to get us going. And I'll come to you if I can in the order that I did your introduction. So Tanya, can we start with you?
Great, thank you. So I'm sure everyone knows that's involved with London Funders who 360 Giving is, but for those that don't, we're a charity that supports funders to share their data in an open, standardised way so it can be accessed, used, analysed by others, and including in our tools, we've got search engine GrantNav. And so at the moment, we've got 225 funders sharing £170 billion worth of grants, and over 30,000 people use our tools each year. So I was asked for like 3 lessons that we've had from the pandemic for the last 2 years. And so I'm going to talk about collaboration, use of data, and equity. So in terms of collaboration, I think that's definitely been driven by the scale of the response needed. It was fantastic to see the increase in collaboration between funders for the crisis response phase of the pandemic, but also the recognition that no organisations could do it alone. And I've been pleased to see the spirit in which that's continuing today. We've seen a number of collaborations continuing, both through Association of Charitable Foundations Funders Collaborative Hub, but also through the London Funders Collaborative Action and Recovery Initiative, but also just consideration of the overall ecosystem. There are a lot more funders who are asking questions about where they fit into things, and so we've been asked for a lot more analysis to support those collaborations. So for me, that's a really positive thing that we'd like to see continuing. And I think also between different types of funders, so we're seeing more of the foundations asking questions about what's happening with statutory funding, and vice versa. I think people are beginning to look at that big picture a bit more. Obviously, I would say this in terms of what we do, but I think the other key learning has been about the importance of data. I don't think it's just been about the importance of publishing and sharing data, although that is definitely a shift that we have seen. It's also about the importance of data needed internally to support decision making. And this partly relates to the first point about collaboration. We're seeing more organisations thinking about how they fit, but also they're needing to make quick decisions and wanting to make the right decisions given the scale of the challenges, and not having the data available to do that, even their own, did impact, I think, for some organisations in the early days. So it's exposed the weaknesses and vulnerabilities that some organisations and funders had, but also they've seen some of the opportunities from using data effectively. So I think that's really shaped funders' current priorities. And for example, we've seen a number that are replacing or upgrading their databases to be fit for future needs, and more are developing more sophisticated data strategies, and we're getting more requests for analysis, both from individual funders and from collaborations and networks as well, which I think is really encouraging. And I think that just shows some of the learning that people have had from the past, but also recognition that of the shift that's happened. And then in terms of equity, I'm sure that others are going to be speaking about this as well. We all saw the racial reckoning that was happening in society, the lessons from many funders who had not explored their own history, practices and impact. And whilst there's certainly more to do, I'm pleased to see that it's continued to inform priorities for many funders. And it's been good to see the engagement that we've had in the DEI data standard, but obviously now we need to see greater results from some of that. And I guess one of the reflections I have and a concern is through the pressure there is to get money to the front line has meant that some funders have changed their criteria, reduced infrastructure spending in their new strategy, which potentially risks losing the capacity and movement building that needs ongoing support. And that's just something that I'm conscious of, and especially having seen the impact of the cuts in 2010, when there was a big retraction in terms of infrastructure funding, I guess worried that we may see the same again. So that was a whistle-stop tour from me.
No, very welcome whistle-stop. Thank you, Tanya. And important themes, I think we will be quite central to the conversation we're having today. So thank you for getting us going with that. Natalie, can I come to you next for some opening thoughts?
Thank you, James. So try not to overlap too much, but because of the space that I'm in, they probably will be. I'm making a huge assumption, but for my reflections is I think that it was quite a humbling moment for funders. I think funders realised a lot about what they don't know. So if we think about like the interactions that in particular minority-led organisations often face into kind of trying to put forward, their ideas about what would work for their communities historically, hasn't necessarily always been received as positively as it would ordinarily be. And I think during the pandemic, people saw it was quite evident where the trust lies, who had the connections. But I think what it then did was when, as you were kind of Tanya was saying about the kind of seeing the urgency of kind of moving funding to the front line, I think it then laid bare the systemic underinvestment in Black and other minority-led organisations. And so even when you're trying to provide large sums of money, which for most of them, they've never experienced this in probably like the lifetime of their organisations existing. Actually, they didn't even have the infrastructure to be able to like move at the pace that was required. I think that racism became a thing because prior to that, all our social problems were down to individual choice and cultural issues and problems with communities. And I think it's kind of started to widen the conversation around structural inequalities and the I suppose the how that is all interrelated into kind of wider systems of oppression. And so it's great now that I think funders are considering how they fund in a more equitable way, but there's still a lot of work to do. I think through some of the work that we've been doing through impact and urban health, for us, we were trying to kind of look at using participatory budgeting. So that was the kind of approach that we decided to use, so that actually it was lived experience, basically determining what was important and what needed to be invested in and who and how. And so for us, we use that as an opportunity to kind of share with funders how you can fund in a very different way of giving quite large sums of money for communities to say, you decide. And I think what we're seeing from our evaluation is that actually they make great decisions about the things that they need. And so I think that is something that I would probably encourage funders to think about more. I also think that funders have become more unapologetic about focusing on race and racism, which I think we haven't really necessarily seen before. And also that recognition that BAME doesn't work. And that actually what we need to do is to respond to the nuances of our experiences as racialized groups, and also kind of thinking from a more intersectional perspective of actually how does your race then intersect with other protected characteristics, and what does that mean for your experiences when we're thinking about your social and emotional and economic outcomes. So I think they're kind of the key things that I think in terms of my reflections of the learning that we could take forward.
Brilliant, thank you, Natalie, and really clearly articulated, I think, in terms of some of their experiences, but some of the challenges that we need to keep challenging back to the funding community about how we can build on for the future. So many themes I think we're going to come back to in the conversation as well. Thank you very much. Ben, over to you.
Well, it's difficult to not really want to engage with what Tanya and Natalie have said, but hopefully we can pick that up in the subsequent chat, because I think in a way the kind of opportunity and the threat or the risk, I think, has kind of been encapsulated by what you both said. So thank you for that. So I'm kind of now just sort of rethinking what I'm going to say. Let's try and sort of create the foundations for kind of optimism, and then we can come on to kind of maybe problematize it in a minute. I mean, the foundations for optimism are, I mean, I think, you know, I am struck by what Natalie's just said, in a way that, in, you know, part of us, those of us who've been involved in this for a long time, can think, did it really require these different events for funders to wake up to, you know, systemic underinvestment in Black and minoritized community-led organizations, or the power of unrestricted funding, etc. And we can pick up on some of those themes. But I think the fact is there are some grounds for optimism. The Open and Trusting initiative, at its heart, is about trying to sustain the progressive practice that we saw at the outbreak of the pandemic, and some of that practice built on little pockets of flexibility that we'd seen after the Grenfell Tower fire, the London Bridge attack, and the Manchester Arena bomb, where the funders who were directly involved really flipped their model on the head, shoveled out significant sums of money to people who needed it very quickly, and the sky didn't fall in. And for some of those people, Co-op Foundation in Manchester, United St Saviours in Southwark, the Tudor Trust in West London, that really radically altered them long term. So, as James said, on the back of the We Stand By the Sector, we launched Open and Trusting in February last year, and by the first anniversary, 100 foundations of all sizes across the UK had signed up to 8 commitments, and I'll post the link in the chat. And thanks to the wonderful work of colleagues at 360 Giving, we know that accounts for about £800 million worth of grants. So, you know, that is important. If we can influence the processes, and particularly the experience of applying for, receiving and spending that money for voluntary and community organizations and social enterprises, that will be a positive outcome. Because whenever we speak to leaders of charities, you know, what is in the top 3 things that causes most stress, most distress, most wasted effort? It is the whole experience of funding. So that we have a positive platform there. And I think that if I look, you know, and I guess the final bit of what I'm going to say, and a kind of more granular example, which I'll also post in the chat, of the work we did with Paul Hamlin Foundation, reviewing their response to the pandemic, I think that again, there are seeds for optimism. I think what we saw was that the starting point shifted for the funding conversation. And it became very simple. Firstly, does this applicant organization have objectives and aspirations that align with our mission? And if yes, then the question becomes, how can we best use the assets at our disposal to help them realize their objectives? The question isn't, how can we ensure that the investment doesn't fail? Or how can we ensure that they do what we think is best? How will you fit into my theory of change? Or the question isn't, how can we keep a careful and watchful eye on them? And for that shift to happen, I think you need a particular kind of leadership, you need a culture around delegation, and you do need, I think, people to embrace the principle of the possible, not the perfect. And a quote from the Hamlin: as an organization, we can agonize and get slightly caught in a loop. And this was the COVID response was the triumph of good enough for now. And there is something now about holding people's nerve through what is still a period of experimentation, and resisting the idea that somehow the uncertainty has gone away. Because clearly the events of recent months and the cost of living crisis and the war in Ukraine, etc., have, you know, shaken us all, albeit in a slightly different way. But we are not out of something called uncertainty. So the conversation about being responsive and flexible needs to begin with, how can we help? Not how do you fit with us, but how can we fit with you? And that, I think, where we see it working well, that is driven by a simple desire to be useful. And it is enabled by giving teams at all levels of foundations more freedom to respond and adapt. I'll stop there.
Thank you, Ben. Again, really, really helpful. I think a lot of learning, which you rightly highlight, isn't always purely about COVID. It's also about how we bring in from other places and other times as well for this. And actually, I might start, if I can, with a question that builds on some of the themes you were just talking there, but also touches on what Natalie and Tanya were saying, which is one that's about what was it that brought about some of these changes from your perspective, and what is it that we can do to try and hold on to that moment or that movement or that opportunity? And I think there's some practical things. We know from our member audit that more funders are signing up to 360 giving. We know from the grants that went out from COVID, as Natalie says, that more of that funding was moving towards groups that were led by communities and a greater awareness of structural racism and injustice. We know from, as you said, Ben, there's learning from previous challenges as well that we can come through, but there's times where sometimes that momentum has been lost, or that, as you just said, Ben, sometimes people can latch onto a certainty that isn't really there, or we can drop back into previous ways of working. So I guess the question, which is, what, from your different perspectives, were some of the motivators for that change that you've seen in the different areas of work, and what maybe can we do to try and hold on to, what can we do to hold on to that? What can you do to give me some more of those foundations for optimism? Tanya, maybe just starting with you, as I say, because we know there is a bigger movement now for open data in particular, and we've seen that. So what were some of the motivations for that, do you think, and how can we build that momentum still?
I think some of it was the pressure of not having a choice, the speed at which things were needing to happen and the scale of the activities meant that organisations were forced to look at things in a different way. And I think in terms of the data side, those that did have data available were able to use it and felt the impact of it. Those that didn't felt the impact of not having it. So an interesting example in terms of one of the reasons why one funder who we'd been talking to for ages and trying to get to publish their data and hadn't, the thing that changed it for them is that they had a really oversubscribed funding round, and they just couldn't possibly support all the organisations that had made applications for emergency grants. This was quite early on, but what they could do is see which community foundations had just made an emergency grant to those same organisations, which meant that they were able to either prioritise funding to organisations that may not have received anything from other funders, or it meant that they were able to look at organisations that hadn't received a grant before from another larger funder, and they were able to look at what does that mean. They could focus their due diligence on brand new organisations or new organisations that weren't the kind of usual suspects of receiving funding, to spend a bit more time on the due diligence for them, rather than having to spend the time on organisations that had received funding before, potentially pre-pandemic, that they didn't need to do the same due diligence on, which actually meant the funding that they gave to much more diverse organisations than they might have otherwise done through that process. But also their motivation was for publishing their data is, we want to pay it forward, because it would be fantastic if everyone else had access to this information on our grants, to be able to inform some of the work that they're doing as well.
Fantastic. And I think that we certainly saw that with the way we were doing the London community response, that actually data became a huge part of driving some of the changes in terms of historic patterns of data, but also where the grants were going in real time, to look at where there are still gaps in the system or where there are opportunities to work better as a system to better support communities. So I sort of hope that awareness is sort of baked in now. You can't sort of go back and say, well, data doesn't matter anymore. It sort of feels like there's momentum in that direction. And Natalie, maybe for you, I mean, in terms of how we keep changing and we keep challenging, I think you rightly said at the beginning, it's a sort of humbling experience to know what you don't know and the communities that you don't have trusting relationships with. But some of those relationships have started to be built, and some of those or strengthened, and some have been brought into a conversation about structural inequalities, structural injustice, structural racism. how do we keep up the momentum on that rather than sort of dropping back to previous ways of working, or what were some of the motivations for change that we can try and keep live in our minds?
So so my hypothesis is that I think when funders are thinking about their investment in terms of addressing social issues or social challenges, if your investment goes into what I always call kind of just minimizing people's suffering, then you're always going to be doing that. And so there is something about funders thinking about where they, so that whole notion of like, where do you sit? There probably aren't enough people really sitting in the systems change space. And that's like where we sit. And one of the reasons for that is it's generally not very sexy until stuff starts moving, and it takes a long time for that. So when you're trying to put a report together, you know, it's not the number of bums on seats or the number of meals that you've given to people, it's the conversations, it's the relationships that you have developed. And that doesn't necessarily always look great on a report, because you're having to trust the process of those conversations and relationships that you're trying to build, because there is always a risk that they will end up going nowhere. And so for us in our work, we've been very lucky that we have been funded in a really flexible way, and that it's been like the infrastructure that has been funded, which has meant that we can flex, we can, you know, adapt, which you're not necessarily able to do when you are funded to run a specific project. So I think that's an important thing for us to think about is how do funders support that systems change piece, so that you then start to see your portfolio changing, because then you might start to see that actually that requirement to fund the stuff which is about minimizing people's suffering becomes like less need. There's less of a need for that than if we actually start fundamentally shifting, you know, the levers that kind of create and sustain inequality.
Thank you. I think that really important message is actually that where we've seen, you know, as Ben said as well, you know, the sky doesn't fall in if you trust people to do the thing that they've got the power, the trust, the relationships to do. And actually sometimes it's about how do you maintain that and how do you build on that. And I think you're right, there's a greater awareness now that you can't always measure some of that stuff in quick and easy ways. And we do need to be more, and you can see where I'm going with this, Ben, as well, open and trusting in how we do our grant making. We need to build some of that in, because change takes a long time. And we're dealing with issues that have been around for a long time, and actually trying to do things in a quick fix way doesn't work in any sector in any way. But sometimes some funding practices can point towards that being seen as something that could be achieved, even though I think we all know it can't. So that movement towards more trusting relationships and more flexibility in how that funding is awarded to give that space for positive change to happen has been a really important theme. And Ben, for you, I think that's also part of it's obviously part of the open and trusting movement, the clues in the name, but that movement of funders there and some of the changes that they brought about, how do you think we go about trying to sustain that momentum rather than the threat of potentially dropping back to previous ways of working, in some ways which do still work? Actually, I'm not saying that everything has to change completely, but there's some things that we want to try and continue to build on. Where can we get that energy from?
Well, look, I think that is an important caveat, because of course, you know, this isn't about 100 foundations who became open and trusting overnight, and it isn't also a movement of 100 foundations who are open and trusting enough. You know, we're dealing with a spectrum here. I think Natalie's point is important. You know, I mean, infrastructure organizations argue for infrastructure funding shock, but I mean, you know, one of the reasons why we were able to get 100 foundations to sign up to something, and you're not just ticking a box, you have to publish your commitments, go on the website, you know, you'll see how people are trying to bring those commitments to life. We've been doing this work for 20 years. So you have to be in it for the long game. And I have, been arguing personally and organisationally about the importance of unrestricted funding for a very long time. And most of the time I've done that, I've been told that people aren't interested in it, because the whole period of the dominance of impact measurement in the sector was really at odds with unrestricted funding. It was the dichotomy was, trust, versus impact. I remember giving a talk saying before impact, there was trust. I mean, that was like 15 years ago. So you do have to be in a long game, and you need funders to have the courage, as Natalie says, to, in a way, invest in organizations and trust them to use their process to bring about conversations and to unearth things and to reveal things. That's a very difficult sell. You could saying, trust me, there will be an outcome, but I'm not sure what it will be, but the process will yield an insight. So I think that's one thing. The moral imperative to act was clear. And I do think, we as an organization felt emboldened to kind of bring to funders' attention what was happening to the organizations that we were supporting. And I do think that was important, the kind of humanizing the experience. And that is not going away. Maintaining that urgency is our responsibility now, because it will, I ran a session a couple of weeks ago for a group of charity leaders, and I just was looking at the notes this morning, and these are quotes from people. This is a gloomy, lonely time. I'm a punch bag. It's like whack-a-mole. I'd quite like a quiet sob or somewhere to go to scream. Sometimes I get to Friday and I think I just can't do this. It's all going to implode soon. Now that's in April 2022, when people are being told that, because they can deliver services face to face, because emergency funding, that somehow we're through something. But I mean, organizations are on their knees and they're struggling to recruit or retain staff. So we do need to keep the drumbeat beating and it needs to be loud, and I think it needs to be concerted, because I'm going to post something in a minute in the chat, but I think there's every reason to fear that this will not stick, this change. The power of the incumbent bureaucracy, as a colleague of mine calls it, the learned behavior of all of our systems, and my organization is no different. It has its way of doing things, and there's always a reason for sticking with that. But the complexity of a foundation, with both the human systems and the kind of data systems, do actually pull you back to the status quo. And the risk is that even though this has been an extended hiatus, this isn't just the emergency response to Grenfell, it is something that has affected everyone in different ways, and this has stretched over 2 years now. Nonetheless, many of those foundations have systems that have been in place a very long time, and many will be more comfortable with a more risk-averse model. So we will need to continue with both carrot and stick, and maybe we can talk about what the carrots and sticks are, but I think, yeah.
Thanks. No, thanks, mate. I'm gonna latch on to carrot as the word to try and continue that positive. If there's a positive drumbeat and a positive awareness of what we can do, and a positive sense of change and momentum towards something better, how can we? I think it's easier to be attracted to things that are going well, or where there's a sense of positivity, or where there's a sense of movement and energy. And there has been in a lot of really good ways over the last couple of years. And as you say, building on foundations that were there from before. So maybe if we go down the carrot route first, what are the good things that are happening? What are the things that we can build from, and where are we going? And maybe Natalie, if I come to you first, because I think your perspective will be really interesting on this, because obviously we've seen, I think, as we say, that for some people the pandemic was the first time structural inequalities were on the agenda at such a level. Black Lives Matter put things on an agenda. People became much more aware, if they weren't already, of the impact of racism and structural racism and inequality and injustice for many communities who've been marginalised by society. And there was an opportunity there where priorities shifted a bit in the funding community to be more aware and more engaged in terms of funding some initiatives that can change in that space as well. From where you sit though, where do you think the priorities for funders are now? And are you seeing funders making some of those longer term commitments to more equitable funding models? Are there some good bits in the system that we can be looking to?
Yeah, so I think that there are a number of funders who are doing some, I think, interesting work, in particular the internal work that they need to be doing as an organisation. So it's all very well funding racial justice work, but then if you're fundamentally very racist on the inside, it kind of defeats the object, doesn't it? So there are some organisations who are doing some really brave work. So like Lankelly Chase, for example, Lankelly Chase Foundation, they're doing some really kind of bold work around kind of, you know, in particular around their internal work, but also thinking about how they resource, you know, good in a different way, so that they are, rather than the funder who is kind of at the top kind of barking down and giving you orders, that actually that whole process of how you arrive at your priorities is something that is a shared process. So I would definitely kind of, you know, reach out to them. One of their projects, Beyond the Rules, is again another program that is looking at how, in the pursuit of doing good, do our structures like legislation, our policies, our way of being and connecting with one another, how that gets in the way of doing what we're trying to achieve. But also what we can kind of do in terms of like testing little projects around kind of disrupting some of, you know, the status quo that I think Ben was kind of talking about. And I think one of the things that I'm quite interested in, we're quite interested in, is how do you resource work in a way where people can come together and you are sort of prioritizing the collective good over individual interest. And historically, the way in which funding has been designed, it has been very much on that kind of scarcity and kind of embedding that scarcity mindset, which then also kind of deepens and entrenches kind of competition, which then is kind of in conflict or tension with kind of collaboration. So they're kind of some of the things that they're trying to work through. And then I think Impact and Urban Health, again, are really deepening their work around their focus on kind of racial justice. And similarly, the Maudsley charity, they are also doing some really focused work, but with that interface with the statutory system in terms of improving mental health outcomes for Black communities primarily, but also other groups that experience marginalisation. So there are people doing some really interesting things, and I think for a lot of this, it's new for a lot of people. So things are going to fail and they're not going to work, and I think that's also okay. I think, but it's that intention and kind of really trying to deliver, which I think is kind of critical.
Fantastic, thank you, Natalie. And Tanya, I guess from the you don't have to look at it from the data side. I always ask you a data question, but you can look at it from any angle you want. But I mean, we've certainly seen in our own work how some of that awareness of what's possible and of the systems, some of the things Natalie's describing, are also being starting to see in the data and how people are using the data. And I was looking at the immigration advice strategy, which I don't know if these things work very well on Zoom. This is certainly not going to work very well on Zoom, but an amazing diagram that you did for us that was part of the immigration advice strategy to try and say, okay, this isn't just one bit of there isn't just a problem here, this is a system and there's lots of things that are going on here, and we need to use data to help to drive some of that positive change. We're certainly doing it in the work that we're doing here with members and partners. Are you seeing funders and colleagues through your work with 360 that are looking at how that can drive some positive change? And where are the carrots there in terms of positive change beyond the pandemic as well?
Yeah, I think so. Thinking about some of the carrots at the beginning of the pandemic, to be honest, we put up the COVID tracker, which was partly to understand the COVID grants, but we designed it in a way which it did have on the front page the list of the funders and how much they each, in order of funder, how much they distributed. And that was actually really helpful because it supported organisations to feel part of that bigger process. But also did get some competition in terms of people wanting to, everyone else is on there, I need to be on there. And I think that has helped in terms of getting a kind of sense of we're in it together. And we've used that in terms of some of our analysis as well. So those kind of who funds with who diagrams has been really helpful for us to work with some of those collaborations to say, you may be speaking to a small group of people, but actually this is how you fit with that wider group. And what we've seen is people having discussions with a broader group that they could be collaborating with rather than their usual friends. And that's been interesting for me in terms of a dynamic which is not completely data led, but it is something that people are beginning to think about more. And I think that's really positive that people are beginning to look at some of that alignment. And it does help that we have a much larger volume of data now than we did at the beginning of the pandemic, like almost, well, more than double in terms of the volume of grants. And so that makes a difference because with richer information, you can do more things with it. But I think there has also been a culture shift of people thinking about the data more and what that means for some of those wider issues that they may be looking at. And I'm not sure that there are many that are properly looking at systems change in the way that Natalie was talking about, but at least recognising that they are part of a wider system in a way that perhaps we hadn't had in terms of the queries and the things that we were being asked for in terms of the analysis before. We're getting asked more of the right questions now. So sometimes we'd be asked for analysis and we would then have to try and unpick what difference would that make. We're now getting more of the right questions because people are thinking about that bigger picture a bit more, I think.
That's really important. I think if the question's right, you're going to get better answer, aren't you? And I think there's some elements of this that it felt like we were doing in slightly more embryonic form before the pandemic. I know when we were looking at violence affecting young people and we looked at the public health model and we looked at the different sort of interventions and opportunities there were to invest and support communities. And the 14 or however many different strands of work. And sometimes you think, well, we're just, in inverted commas, funding children, young people work over here, or we're just funding domestic violence interventions over here. But those are for the same people in the same communities and in the same space, the multitude of things that help to create an environment where people are safe from violence. And I think when you've got some of the data that we had at the beginning where we can say, well, funders are here, here, and here, and it looks like a system when you put it together like that, but we're not understanding it as a system because we're not asking the right questions and we're not putting it together in the right way. It feels like from what you're saying that some of those questions are starting to be the ones that people are starting with now rather than retrofitting, as it were, or trying to ask the wrong thing too late. So that feels positive. What a big bunch of carrots we're developing in this session. This is fantastic. And Ben, sticking with the carrots, obviously you were talking earlier, and it's fantastic that over 100 funders are already part of that open and trusting grant making movement. But if you were to sort of say some of the lessons about how funders have gone on to become more trusting and flexible, what have been some of the carrots there? And maybe if I could just picking up a comment from, I think it was Rachel in the chat, about some of that also needing to be at lots of different levels. You know, sometimes you can build a community of understanding and then it will get to a decision-making panel, be that trustees or councillors in a public body who maybe haven't been part of that initial conversation, and how you sort of bring the hearts and minds along there changes at lots of different levels, and how you build open and trusting grant makers throughout the organisation and throughout the partnerships that they're part of. What are the carrots on that journey for us?
Oh boy, I mean, this is a hell of a conversation for someone who's supposed to be on leave, but I think Rachel's question is absolutely crucial, and Rachel, please do follow up. We're doing some work over the next fortnight with evaluation and learning staff and foundations, but also trustees and CEOs, quite unusually, around this whole idea of learning governance. which is that learning should not be seen as a sort of luxury add-on, but is actually integral to, inverted commas, good governance, and should sit alongside the formal accountability requirements. And at its heart is this idea of strategic learning, that you use data in order to ask, so what, now what, as a foundation, rather than the fixation on what data, which tends to have been the dominant model. But I think that this will not be a truly transformational moment unless there is alignment within foundations, from mission board right through to the kind of grant making system. And so whilst some stuff may be done by stealth and subterfuge, it won't last if it hits questions at trustee level. I'm going to quote now: how will this £10,000 grant achieve measurable impact on this deeply rooted systemic issue in the next 12 months? Be specific. Or give us concrete numbers that our £20,000 grant made a significant impact on a deeply entrenched multi-generational issue. These are real things that people are being asked. And often the anxiety does stem from trustees. Sometimes it stems at a grant officer level, who imagine that trustees are going to be very risk averse. So, we're using the word systems here, and they're operating at kind of different, we've got different systems at play here, but one is the foundation as a system. It really does need to be aligned, and we have got to be able to engage with trustees. So Rachel, yes, for no charge, I will happily come and talk to the trustees. But what Natalie said is really interesting, because I think, if we think about Lankelly and some of those examples, which are kind of at one end of the spectrum, we are really looking at a paradigm shift there. If I was to talk to most of at least half of the foundations who are in open trusting there, and if I was to start to talk about paradigm shifts and power, I think people would panic or might not renew their commitments next year. And we very deliberately did not say this is really about power. We know, in however many of us are on this webinar, that it kind of really is about power. And actually some power is being shifted in a way that isn't actually unsettling, and that is yielding great results. One of the most powerful things you can do to shift power is just by giving unrestricted funding and allowing someone to report in their own words, because that is trusting me to know best. And therefore in that system, the system of the social change that we're focused on, where the funder is bringing some assets and I am bringing assets of connections and expertise and relationships in a community, and the community is bringing its assets, in that system, if we can, the carrot is better work and better opportunities and better, inverted commas, results, because each bit of the system is playing to its strengths and is less encumbered, including the foundation is less encumbered by mounds of paper and data and hostility and expectations that are not required. And we are freed up to be the best that we can be. But I think we got to recognize, that one of the great, it may be a frustrating feature of philanthropy, but one of its great strengths is pluralism. That actually there are foundations who will give, 25,000 a year for 3 years without too many restrictions on that. And actually that money will be spent on relieving immediate poverty and distress. As there are also foundations like Lankelly who won't even talk about grants and grant making, and are using their assets in a different way. And it seems to me that is really important, that pluralism, because it kind of reflects the pluralism of civil society into which that money is going. But I think that I do like this, what both Natalie and Tanya indirectly were talking about, that I think that enabling people to think and act systemically in a way that is meaningful for them, it is really important. That doesn't mean that every foundation has got to become a systems change funder, or indeed, which is the most egregious outcome, is every applicant now has to talk about systems change. But I do think enabling people to see where they fit and what that means, it is important, and finding a language for that, it is going to be important.
Thank you, Ben. I think that the pluralism point is really critical as well, because I think sometimes there is a tendency, and we often get asked, you know, what is best practice now? I think, well, it's lots of things. It's not, there isn't this perfect answer that means that you've solved all your problems forever. And when we looked at it with the London Community Response, you know, we said emphasis on core funding, emphasis on flexible funding, etc. And we had one wave of funding where people had the opportunity to ask for a core grant or to ask for a project grant. And it wasn't the case that everybody wanted a core grant. There were things that were quite specifically project style funding that people needed to do specific bits of work. And I think that even just something as simple as, do we just all do core, or do we all do project? You know, that diversity is important to reflect the needs of communities differently. And I think I'm sure colleagues will post some of the learning reports from the London Community Response that bring out some of that as well. So we'll look at that in the chat. And if we sort of take that and we think about, okay, from all of your different perspectives, what are you hearing now? You know, what are people telling you? What does the data tell you now? What are the things that we should focus on for the future? Where are those voices, and what's the intelligence telling us some of the things that should be at the forefront of our mind? Natalie, I might come to you first, just because I think you've got two potential angles you can go down on this. Because obviously you've got the work with Black Thrive, and you've done a report, I think, back in December 2020 about the experience of Black people and what a community-wide recovery could look like beyond COVID-19. Obviously, this is a constantly evolving situation, but are there things that different things that you're hearing from the community now in terms of voices, but also with your Building Strong Communities hat on? We've had things like the festival of ideas that generated a lot of insights from communities about what a strong community looks like. So from all those different voices, if we're trying to boil that down to a sentence or two, what are you hearing from people about where our thoughts should be for the future?
So I think inequalities are not going away. In fact, they're going to become more entrenched. I suppose the good news is that communities with lived experience are energized and ready to mobilize. So I think that there is something about how we can work collectively to be able to support people to do the things that need to be done in terms of kind of both imagining and also realizing what recovery looks like. And I think sort of going back to the Festival of Ideas, kind of communities were asked about, you know, what will it take to create a strong community? And that's not to say that communities are not already strong, but actually how do we create the environment in which people can thrive? And so we had over 104 events across London boroughs, and there were kind of 7 key themes. So there was something about how services are better able to meet local needs. So I think that there is something about how we support people. This is not a sentence, I do apologise. I think there's something about kind of creating space for people to be able to come together, because actually without that opportunity to come together, it's very difficult to reimagine and realise a new future. And I think broadly we're kind of making sure that communities are really at the centre of decision making.
That was a perfect sentence, Natalie. I had a lot of
I had loads of commas and I always get told by Grammarly that I have my sentences are too long.
That's also a bit of feedback I've had, so I'm with you on your sentence. But really, really important points, and we'll post the link to the Black Thrive report. But also, I think some of the festival ideas things. I think there's some resources we can again post for colleagues as well, so you can be building on some of that learning as well. Because as you said, that was really important to hear from community groups about what their experiences were. And Ben, maybe I could come to you next, because obviously you were talking there a little bit about what you're hearing from civil society groups who are part of the networks and groups that you're part of, but also you'll be hearing things from funders in response to that, or in the same room as that. Where are some of those discussions going?
I think it's really, I'm not sure. I'm going to be honest. I think part of the reason that my sentence is beginning in a very imprecise way is because I think one of the things we're struggling with, we're running an extension of our emergency support at the moment called Leading in Uncertainty, and one of the things, and we've got 7 partners across the UK that we're working with, networks, mainly people who are far away from this kind of resource normally. And one of the questions we're asking ourselves is, what word or are we going to use to describe the context? Because I think that's one of the challenges that we're facing. Are we in this moment of upheaval? Is it leading in upheaval rather than uncertainty, such that actually there is both, on the one hand, a tremendous opportunity to experiment, to build on some of the things we've seen that have been talked about this morning, delegating funds to partners with no track record of distributing funds, really meaningful co-design, really starting way further upstream than things normally happen, even to the extent of programs, the concept of success being described and defined by the people who are the participant, etc. Is there that moment, or is there exhaustion? And Rachel's point about the reversion to the calcified system of pre-COVID, people have had enough of innovation, flexibility, etc., and they need things to settle. And we are all feeling that. We have that internally, the polarity between kind of fast and slow. So I think holding our nerve is one of the things that I think we, organizations such as ours, need to support foundations to hold their nerve. That might mean a slightly more sober ask at times of what they can and should be doing. It might mean more intentional and kind of planned experimentation, if that's not a contradiction in terms. Because I think we have got to recognize that, the thing, sorry, and I will finish getting to the full stop, that the thing that I think most preoccupies the people that we work with, both charities and foundations, is actually well-being at the moment. The ability to get up, do the job in a state of kind of exhaustion, bewilderment. So got to be very mindful, I think, that is what people are bringing into their workplace, because the risk is that will not go well. So I think we've got to be careful.
Thank you, Ben. And Natalie will be delighted that someone's got an even longer sentence than her. You can feed that back to your critics, Natalie. But I think really important themes. And actually that last point about the understanding that all of this is happening at a time of exhaustion, trauma for a lot of people as well, and how you keep going through that as an individual, never mind as an organisation, is a real challenge, and shouldn't be discounted or under reflected, I guess, in terms of how we do this work for the future. And Tanya, maybe just a thought from you on that, what you're hearing as well, because you were talking at the beginning about also how data can get to another level in a way. There's DEI data as well as sort of core grants data, and all of that is sort of conversational with the people who you're working with in terms of how they're going to use that and where they see opportunities for the future. So what are you hearing?
Yeah, and I think for me that also relates to the points about the experimenting. I think my conclusion would be thinking about what is the data you're going to need in the future to be able to answer the questions that you would want to ask in the future, and like kind of recognizing data is a bit of a long game. We need to get comfortable with it being dynamic, iterative process. There isn't a perfect end to it, just a cycle of collecting, analyzing, learning and refining, but we need to be thinking about the future questions so that we can build that into some of the thinking and not kind of go, well, we've got that wrong, but there's nothing that we haven't started thinking about what the next thing might be. So thinking about those experiments, thinking about what future communities might look like, what might it help us to start building in terms of the data to be able to support us to answer some of those questions or do those experiments or tests or whatever it happens to be in the future.
No, fantastic, absolutely. And I think that awareness of how all these bits fit together is really important, because sometimes it thinks, well, voice is over here and data is over here, but actually it's one thing. How do we make sense of it and how do we work through it is really important. I'm going to round off with one final question for our panel, if I may, which is what we're going to do now. What action, we've had this discussion, what actions would you be encouraging of people to take following this discussion? And I guess you could take a number of different angles with that, just to give you a moment to think about it. One of which is obviously there are funders on the call. Are there particular things, sort of calls to action you'd encourage funders on the call to be reflecting on? London Funders itself is going through our strategy review at the moment, and we will have our amazing new vision shortly, as soon as we've written it, but we're really keen again to get ideas for what we should be focusing on. So if you've got reflections for us, by all means give me an action as well, and if you're feeling particularly energetic, you can take an action yourselves. What action should we take following this discussion? Ben, you were muted first, so I'm going to go to
you. I mean, sorry, it's slightly self-interest here, but I think that we've talked about the need to maintain the sense of urgency, and I think also we need to constantly root this in the experience of organizations and the communities and causes that they're serving. So we want to hold foundations to account for being open and trusting and not assume they are, and we're putting a charity survey on what does open and trusting look and feel like or not. And I think we need to get a lot of responses to that. I think it matters. I think we're the vehicle for that, but we have got an audience there, 100 plus funders, 800 million pounds of grants. That is an opportunity to hold people's feet to the fire, and in a way to kind of for it to move on from COVID to being the kind of a 2022 account of what matters to people. Because I think, as I said earlier, we've got to keep that drumbeat loud and support each other's. I mean, Natalie's posted something in the chat. I think kind of supporting each other's efforts is really important.
Fantastic. Thank you, Ben. Tanya, I've just realised that your name has all of the letters of action in it, so I'll come to you next. I don't know what the rest of the anagram would be, but it's my Wordle brain has just noticed that.
Not something I've noticed before. I think it would be my last point, thinking about what are the questions that we're going to need to answer in the future, and so that we don't end up in a position of not being able to make some of those decisions that we need to make, and we're not necessarily going to get them all right. But I think having that kind of context with the awareness that we have now of thinking about the future, because there is a risk that the learning that we have gets forgotten quite quickly, and so kind of doing some of that thinking where there's capacity to, I think, will be quite important.
Fantastic, thank you, Tanya. And Natalie's posted a potential action in the chat, which is to sign up for a session coming up this week. What other thoughts would you leave us with?
So I would agree with what Ben and Tanya had said. I suppose my other sort of ask would be for funders to think about their role in the system around addressing some of the structural issues. So as Ben was saying, not everybody needs to become a systems change funder, but I think if we can be a bit more deliberate in terms of understanding where and how we are acting within the system, and then also kind of starting to join the dots, I think would be really helpful. So you'll have people working on the ground doing, you know, surface intelligence that could be really helpful for systems change work, for example. Doesn't mean that people in the systems change space needs to be doing that work on, you know, the ground in that way, you know. So I think that it's joining the dots would be helpful.
Okay, thank you. Important actions, which I'm sure everyone on the call is going to take away, and we'll also be posting this on our YouTube channel so that we can encourage more people to take these actions as well. I think some really important themes there. There's been a lot of positive change, a lot of increased awareness, a lot of increased understanding, a lot of trust, a lot of relationships built, and a lot of energy, I think, over the last couple of years, despite the real difficult, challenging, upsetting circumstances we've been through. People are out there doing good stuff and making good things happen. There's a real opportunity to build on that, and I think I'm really grateful to Ben, to Tanya, to Natalie for sharing their thoughts about what that looks like and how we build on that, because we really want to hold that for the future. As Ben said, you know, holding our nerve. How do we keep on doing these in a time that is still very, very uncertain? So we're not saying this is all done and dusted and now this is the foundation from which we build. It's a combination of factors that we need to keep in mind. Some of those are themes that we're going to explore a little bit more in the final session of these three, which is coming up next Tuesday, the 26th. And Chloe will post a link in the chat to sign up for that if you haven't already. And I'm also going to do another little plug, which is Tanya was talking about, you know, making sure that we don't forget that learning. You know, there's that fear that we might lose some of that learning. London Funders will not let you lose that learning, partly because we've got our Festival of Learning coming up in a few weeks' time, actually, from the 9th to the 20th of May. So this time last year, we had nearly 1,000 of you join us for sessions across the fortnight. We're repeating that again this year, so we'd like to see more than 1,000 of you this year. That's my target for it. There's a whole load of sessions that are available, looking at things like equity, collaboration, and how we can build that stronger future based on the learning that we've taken from funders, from civil society, from communities over the last year. So the programme for that is going out to members later on today, so do not sign up for sessions there, so we can continue to build on that learning for the future. But for today, I'm going to close by just thanking again to Ben, to Tanya and Natalie for joining us this morning and for sharing their thoughts and their reflections on how we can build together for the future. And thank you for being part of that conversation as well. We hope there's some really good ideas and some good action that you can take following today. And if you need any help or access to any of the resources we've posted in the chat, do just get in touch with us at the London Funders team, and we can make sure you're connected in the right way. But for now, enjoy the rest of your day, and we look forward to seeing you again soon.